Hello and welcome to another episode of Transforming Business with me, Marvin Schneider. Thanks for tuning in. In this podcast series, I talk about all things business transformation, but not any generic kind of business transformation that a lot of the mainstream consulting firms are talking about. The kind of transformation I'm talking about is the deep-rooted transformation from the boardroom down to the shop floor that will enable corporations, large corporations, to create wealth on an ongoing basis in a sustainable way, in ways that enhance societal well-being. And when I'm talking about societal well-being, I'm talking about enhancing the well-being of the individual, the wider community, and the environment. And so this is a very broad-based transformation agenda. It is much more extensive than your typical one or two off ESG initiatives. And so a lot of good work and good thinking is going on in the business community around the need, particularly around sort of delivering on ESG outcomes, particularly environmental outcomes. But my sense is that it's just way not enough, and there's much more work to be done. And so that's why I am putting my life's purpose into a global initiative to transform the global business and the investment communities, because both of those constituents have a very important role to play, because ultimately it is the corporations, the companies that produce products and services that, that where society will benefit from the transformation of that or those things. But the investment community, and particularly the institutional investment community, has a very big role to play in facilitating that transformation. And so I'm going to be talking about a lot of what that transformation entails and how to go about it, and some of the ideas and thoughts and capabilities and digital assets that I've created over the last decade or so as a foundation for that whole transformation process. So stay tuned in to the podcast series. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search for Valuation Insights. That's the name of the channel. And the name of the podcast series is Transforming Business. So that's the intro. I'm going to be starting to delve into quite technical topics in the next couple of episodes around valuation, the nature of wealth creation, the corporate finance underpinnings of that, the corporate strategy, business unit strategy, elements to it, the operations, supply chains, all of those things. So that's going to be quite cerebral. And but before I delve into those very tangible, very specific, but very insightful topics, I find it necessary to put out a preliminary episode, which is what this one is, around some more intangible topics. And what I'm really talking about at the moment is mindsets and motivations and intentions, those kinds of things. What I'm really talking about is raising the consciousness of business. And the reason why this is important is because the vast majority of the global business and investment community is currently operating at a very low level of consciousness. It's very regressive, dog-eat-dog, self-interested, self-motivated, me, money, power structures, male energy, very low level of consciousness. And it's this low level of consciousness, or the perpetuation of this low level of consciousness, that has created the conditions and the situation, the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And so which creates the problems and the negative outcomes that businesses create for consumers, employees, the wider community, the environment. And so, it's important to understand that you cannot solve a problem at the same level of consciousness or thinking process that created the problem in the first place. And so, from my perspective, one of the precedent, almost requirements, is that the mindset of business leaders and the paradigm in which they think about their business needs to fundamentally shift. And the only way that I understand how to do that is to start thinking about your businesses from a higher level of consciousness. So we're going to talk about higher consciousness a little bit, and particularly higher consciousness in business. I fully understand that a lot of people that are listening to this might be very challenged by these ideas because they confound existing mainstream thought processes, the conservative right, the conservative religious right. And so I fully understand that. And that's okay, because those people that will reject what I'm about to say probably really aren't ever going to be on the forefront of the transformation process. But the thing is that at one point or another, even though the original naysayers and resistors and deniers will kick and scream and struggle and, reject, at one level or another, whether they are latecomers to the process, they're going to have to get on board, because there is a steamrolling motion happening in the broader community in the raising of consciousness, human consciousness. And so you don't necessarily need to lead, be on the vanguard of the shift into higher consciousness, but golly gosh, it certainly helps. And in any case, once there is a sufficient momentum and movement forward, there's going to be an avalanche. And so the tipping point will come when there are a small number initially, but then an increasing acceleration of business leaders and the broader community that are waking up and realizing that the issues are currently dominated in very low consciousness, regressive mindsets, and that the solution is to adopt higher consciousness. So when I'm talking about higher consciousness, I'm talking about more sort of intangible things. And I'm not talking about any sort of religious kind of mindsets. But what I am talking about is the notion that as humans, and and basically pretty much everything on the planet is intricately connected in universal consciousness. And so this idea of universal consciousness and universal conscientiality is heavily understood for thousands of years, particularly in Eastern philosophical thought processes. And so I don't subscribe to any sort of mainstream religious viewpoint. In fact, I pretty much reject most of it. But in terms of getting some reference point for what I'm talking about, I think the Buddhist thought process is probably closest to being representative of what I'm talking about today. And so if you want a little bit more of a reference point, you might want to start thinking about, Buddhist thinking and thought process on the purpose of life, our connection into universal consciousness, and our connection to source, which is the, if you like, the repository or the first cause of that universal consciousness. So let me take a couple of layers off this topic, and this isn't going to be a too much of a woo-woo thing. It's just a little bit of an introduction. So when we're thinking about universal consciousness, one of the first ideas or understandings is that we are all, not just some, we are all spiritual beings having a human experience. And the nature and the purpose of that human experience is to expand universal consciousness. And so if you think about that a little bit further, if we are spiritual beings having a human experience, then the experience that we're having right here, right now, is just one very small, infinitesimally small part of a much, much bigger picture of experience. And so you can't go too much further in this conversation without bringing forward the notion of reincarnation and the idea that as spiritual beings, we have had many incarnated lives, not just this current one. And interestingly, not all of those incarnated lives would necessarily have been played out on this planet. So that's the kind of the more kind of woo-woo, and I wouldn't even call it woo-woo. I mean, to me, it's just these days, it's like, well, yes, of course. And the other interesting thing is that more than 1 billion people are already tapped into this idea. Now, I realize that there's another sort of 6 or 7 billion people that aren't tapped into this idea, and that's a bit problematic because those that really operate with the sort of single incarnated life scenario are going to struggle to take the higher vantage point and the bigger picture and to operate into higher consciousness. And in the long run, that's, while they might reject the idea in this lifetime, at the end of the day, they're going to have to get on board because there's no other way about it, if that makes sense. Okay, so if we're spiritual beings having a human experience for the purpose of expanding universal consciousness, then the next kind of idea in this is that we are all part of the collective and we are all part of source. And the goal of these human experiences is to get closer to source. And the only way you can do that is to outflow, to operate from the heart first and let the mind be the servant of the heart. In other words, when you're outflowing in this way, what you're really doing is serving humanity. So it is a life and an intention and a purpose in life to be predominantly of service to the bigger collective. And that's the kind of fundamental idea that I'd like to lay down as being a foundation for this transformation. Because at the end of the day, the primary purpose of business in this higher consciousness environment is to serve humanity. And we're going to talk about how that happens and how wealth is created when that happens, and what the problem is if you don't seek to be of service to society and continue to perpetuate the regressive dog-eat-dog paradigm, which is a dead paradigm, right? This is something that I'd like to sort of lay out there, is that this is not necessarily a nice to have. It is an imperative. And there's a couple of ways that you can think about this as business leaders, right? So initially, a lot of business leaders, and I'm talking about board chairs, CEOs, senior executives, board members. These are the groups of people that have the skills, the resources, the mandate to lead their organizations in a purpose or another purpose. And so I kind of lost the thread of where I was going, but it's really important that business leaders this is where I was going to say, sorry, there you go. It's really important that business leaders understand that there is a seismic shift going on within the broader community towards awakening in the understanding that I just described, that we're spiritual beings, we're ultimately connected to source, and the primary purpose of life is to outflow and to be of service to society, humanity, the broader collective. And anything outside of that is really taking you off the path towards enlightenment. So there are about 1 billion people currently on the planet that already operate with that as an idea. Now, here's the important thing for business. If business is operating with a regressive mindset and is operating outside of the expectations of the broader community, then you are alienating a large part of your potential customer client base. And you're jeopardizing, your revenue streams. The people that are awakening will not be interested in becoming employees of your corporations. And so you think about what's going on with COVID or post-COVID these days. I think most people that are listening to this video will be intimately connected with and understand the concept of the big resignation. So there's a lot of people, and maybe COVID was just a trigger, but I suspect it's a lot of people that are already either have gone through the spiritual awakening process or are starting along that journey that are going, you know what, Mr. CEO, Madam CEO, chairs, no thank you. Your organizations are inconsistent in their principle, their purpose, and their operations with my expectations. And so not only are you losing on the most valuable asset that any corporation can have in the wealth creation game, which is people, not only are you going to lose your most valuable assets, which is people, you're also going to lose customers, and therefore the whole organization will become increasingly irrelevant in the broader community and will ultimately fail. And so maybe that is enough motivation for those forward-thinking chairs and CEOs. And I focus on chairs and CEOs. It's for a particular reason, is because ultimately they are the two people or power structures within corporations that can really set the motion forward for the transformation process. So it's so important that the desire, the motivation, the intention, and the commitment to undertake the transformation that I'm going to be describing over many, many podcast episodes, it's so important that that commitment, motivation, intention resides initially in the minds of the chair, supported by the CEO, obviously executed by the CEO, but 100% supported by the chair and the board. It will not work the other way. The kind of transformation that we're talking about is so fundamental from top to bottom that you can't sort of try and work your way through middle management, because ultimately middle management is like a quagmire. It's going to get bogged down. Anyway, we are talking about higher consciousness. So, one of the best ways to manifest this higher consciousness is in reflecting and understanding what the purpose of the corporation is. And if there is any reflection in the purpose of the corporation, which is dominated primarily about making money, maximizing the money take, or a primary focus on serving the short-term interest of short-term shareholders, then 100% you are not operating at a principle of higher consciousness. So higher consciousness starts with an intention that the purpose of the corporation is to put into the market products and services delivered in a particular sustainable way, where those products and services and the delivery system enhances the well-being of the individual, the wider community, and the environment. In other words, the purpose of the corporation is fundamentally dominated in being of service to society. And anything other than that just ain't going to cut it. Last thought on higher consciousness, because I could talk about this topic forever and a day, but hey, this isn't a spiritual channel. This is a business channel. But the last thought about higher consciousness and why it's relevant to the business community is that ongoing sustainable wealth creation is fundamentally an endeavor in creativity and in innovation. Innovation and creativity are the primary drivers of ongoing wealth creation. So let's just think about the word creativity. Creativity is it's a process, but the end outcome of it is to create something which is new, right? So creativity creates something. And the creation must, in one way or another, fundamentally enhance the well-being of society. If the focus and effort of that creative effort is not dominated in that first fundamental question, which is how do whatever it is that I'm going to create fundamentally enhance the well-being of society, then at the end of the day, it's it's got a very limited shelf life. And so here's what I want to say about creativity and creatives. Creative people, which are the primary valuable asset in any corporation, creative people have an innate ability to tap into higher consciousness, direct knowingness, um, be in the zone. And so it's really important that the business leaders are able to operate in higher consciousness and tap into direct knowingness, tap into their higher self, because in tapping into that higher self, you're going to get the answers, the solutions, the path forward. Being able to tap into direct knowingness, almost on demand is one of the greatest skills and assets to any corporation in the new paradigm, the new generation. So hopefully this is a little bit of food for thought. We won't be touching on these kind of intangible topics too often, but at the end of the day, I'm here to stimulate, create, and motivate a global movement towards transformation. And so that global movement will only get momentum when people get on board. And so I fully understand that probably 70 to 80% of the audience listening and, the chairs, board members, CEOs, senior executives of the large proportion of the 16,500 very large listed companies in the world probably won't immediately jump and resonate on this topic and agenda. But here's the thing, and I want to actually, perhaps I'll end by telling you two stories actually. One is I fully expect that there is a proportion, maybe 5-10%, small but important proportion of business leaders that are in a position of power and influence that do get what I'm saying and have intuitively understood, or they intuitively understand that there is a requirement for fundamental change, and they're willing to take a leadership position on that. And not that I'm going to do a shout out to too many people on this podcast gratuitously, but I do want to give a shout out to one business leader in Australia. His name is Andrew Forrest, who, we need to see the rubber hit the road. But basically what he's saying at the moment is that he is fundamentally committing billions and billions of dollars of his corporation's money backed by shareholders to generate green hydrogen, green steel, in the steel manufacturing side of the industry. And this is the kind of leadership and fortitude that's going to be required. Now, my sense is that there is a small proportion, currently a small proportion of chairs, CEOs, senior executives that kind of get it and want to be part of this. And I think my sense is that a lot of those are actually going to be women chairs, women senior executives, and women CEOs. Here's why. About a year ago, I was participating in a series of board forums. There was about at least half a dozen, maybe 10 individual forums where we had a dozen board members from Australia, New Zealand, predominantly. So it's this region oriented, talking about the topic of executive reward and how intractably corrupt and wrong it is and how we can fix it. And in those conversations, myself and a then colleague of mine were introducing some of these ideas around, you know, purpose to be of service to society, and then, you know, what that means for the way companies are run and what that means in terms of reward structures for those senior executives that are at the helm of directing these companies. The interesting thing is that a lot of the, you know, predominantly white male chairs basically couldn't get their mind beyond the mire of, you know, the current paradigm. But a lot of the women chairs and executives did get it. And I think that is going to be one of the saving graces and where this momentum is going to start. So here's a call to action. If you're watching this, and I really do hope you watch this and, you know, share this widely, all of the podcast episodes that I'm going to be putting out. If you're watching this and this resonates, please get in contact with me, because there's so much work to be done. You know, if you've made your billions of dollars like Bill Gates and various others, and now have, you know, in the latter part of your career, realize that there is more to life than just making, you know, tens, 20, 30, 50, $100 billion, and you want to start allocating some of that money and resource to fundamental change, please get in contact with me. There is so much work to be done, and we don't have a whole lot of time. The last story that I want to leave you with is about 20 years ago, I was in my mid-30s, and I was a mid-level executive at one of Australia's largest banks, and I'm not going to name it because it's just not relevant. But and I'd come into that corporate career path from a dominant mainstream strategy consulting career path, where I was a strategy consultant in some of the most revered institution consulting houses on the planet. And so then I sort of stepped into a corporate life, and it was the culture was so toxic, and it so represented the low consciousness that is so prevalent in so many organizations that, you know, I'm amazed that these organizations function, because they were so dysfunctional. But the interesting thing is that the CEO at the time, and again, I won't name him, he did something very brave. And what he did, very bold as well, particularly for 20 years ago, he basically brought on board one of the mainstream consulting firms to put together a program basically teaching the senior executives in this bank how to operate in higher consciousness. And it included sort of meditation, mindfulness, yoga, but various other practices. And every executive and senior manager, and so we're talking about 1,000 people, were put through a 3-day retreat. And some had a series of these retreats focused on the softer sciences of humanity. And it was heavily dominated in the more intangible things, the spiritual understanding that I started this episode on. The funny thing is that after I went through my 3-day retreat with probably 20 of my colleagues, they kind of took them 20 at a time, thereabouts, over 3 days, spent a lot of money on this program. I very quickly realized that my purpose, motivation, and intention was incongruous with the organizations, and I left. And that was 2 decades ago. And I think we're going to see, if we don't see a lot of fundamental shift very quickly, this is going to be the new manifestation, or this is going to be a reflection of the Great Resignation. So it's kind of really important that business leaders get this. So let me end it there. Thanks for tuning in. Please like, share, subscribe to the YouTube channel. It kind of helps get the message out. It's so important that the message gets broad coverage. I post this up on my LinkedIn profile. So if you see me on LinkedIn, please like it, please share it, please re whatever it is that they call it in LinkedIn. I'm not a big social media fan, so I effectively use LinkedIn begrudgingly, but there you go. You got to do what you got to do. Thanks for tuning in. Look forward to welcoming you next time in the podcast series, and bye for now.